Good morning, and welcome to TAO's next session of our Member Resiliency series, Resiliency in Higher Education with PSU President, Dr. Stephen Percy. I'm Skip Newberry, President and CEO of TAO. A couple of rules of engagement to go over before we get started. All participants have been muted, so please remain on mute unless a TAO staff member unmutes you or calls on you to talk. You may ask or respond to questions in the chat box publicly or privately by directing your message to Justin Martinez or Kara Snow, and we'll monitor the chat box throughout the discussion. We'll ask you all to engage via the participant icon on your screen. Please engage with us on social media. If you take a screenshot of myself and President Percy, we'll gladly reshare that. So social media activity is definitely encouraged. And due to the limited time, we'll capture all questions in the chat and shift any unanswered questions to our online member engagement platform, which is called Mobilize. And it's our virtual community where you'll see all the unanswered questions addressed after today's discussion. If you have any questions about joining Mobilize, please feel free to reach out to Justin, whose email is on the screen. And if you have any questions about joining TAO, please reach out to membership@techoregon.org. TAO staff support today is provided by Kara Snow and Justin, who are happy to take feedback, questions, comments, and also discuss sponsorship opportunities. A huge thank you to Portland State University as well as AT&T for underwriting this series. We appreciate their sponsorship and support. Please join us Tuesday, June 9th for our next digital health session with Jennifer Stoll, who's the Executive Vice President of Government Relations and Public Affairs with OCHN, and Oregon State Representative Rachel Prusak. It's my pleasure to introduce PSU's President, Dr. Stephen Percy. Dr. Percy had an impressive career in higher education working at the University of Virginia, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and the University of Baltimore before joining PSU 5 years ago as the Dean of the College of Urban and Public Affairs. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Percy.
It's my pleasure.
Well, I was wondering, just by way of background, if you could describe a little bit about kind of what you do on a daily basis as President of Portland State.
Skip, thank you so much for inviting me today. I've so enjoyed getting to know you and the members of TAO, and I see so many connections between our institution and the work you're doing and so many potential partnerships. So it's always a pleasure to join you and the members of your organization. I would say that if I answered that question when I started the job as interim president in May of 2019, and when I would tell you my job today has changed dramatically. Our day-to-day job these days is to be constantly monitoring the health conditions in our communities, the needs of our student and faculty, and adapt. Like so many companies that are with us today and organizations, it's been a time of great challenge and the need to find responses to challenges we didn't even know we had. And so a lot of my work now is working with my executive team, working more directly together on a day-to-day basis to explore the latest issue or challenge or opportunity that we have. And that's very exciting. It's brought our team together a lot. It has increased the intensity of our work. I'm sure everybody else is facing that, but our day-to-day job is to come together in different ways, and people have the areas they're working on and coming together and figuring out the right solution to it. For a while, of course, it was how do we respond to keep things even going in the time when we were beginning to close down, stay at home, and work in a different way. And now the challenge is how do we come back out of that? How do we open back up? We're never really closed, but how do we open back up and respond to the needs and the challenges and the opportunities to sustain the educational achievement and advancement of our students?
I'm wondering if we talk a little bit about the pandemic and the ensuing crisis. How did that impact PSU, and what are some sort of trends you're paying attention to in terms of higher ed and what the crisis may mean for it?
Well, let me start by making a distinction between online and remote learning, just because that'll give a context to what I want to say. Online learning is educational pedagogy that goes through quite a bit of course development and thinking and organization of materials and lectures and access to tapes and whatever it is you're doing, some different kind of knowledge base where the instructor has planned it out that he or she will not be directly interacting with students face to face, but they have a rich system of information and knowledge and a very thought out way of interacting with students in chat rooms or conversations or other kind of things. There's so many different ways to specifically organize to have a really highly effective online course. Well, we have a lot of those. In Oregon, our institution is one of the top leaders in the number of online courses we have. But when the pandemic hit, we were just about to end the winter term. We had finals the next week when we're thinking what to do. And we had this big question to start. It's Friday before finals. Everybody's getting ready. Do we cancel? But the news was getting to be so clear that we canceled. And so then we had to say to our faculty, first of all, you got to figure out how to do whatever final exam or final exercise you want to do online or, interactively. And then we said, okay, in the spring term, we're going to just have to be working remotely. So the faculty that were not going to be in the formal online courses had to figure out strategies in a very short term, about 1 week, which was normally spring break, to move to remote, which means learning using Zoom, using technology, reorganizing themselves to interact remotely, but they were not fully online courses. So we had 3,500 sections that were moved to remote format in about a 10-day period. That was a gargantuan task. People who weren't used to these technologies, hadn't planned it out, hadn't had time to plan it out, did an amazing job. I can't speak more highly of our faculty that worked very hard to change the courses to remote. The other thing that we had to do was that successful education is not just courses. Of course, that's critical, but so are all the many support services. So our advisors went online, our health services went online, our bursar went online. So all the things that could go online, and our service support systems also did. And they too had to innovate using technology of communication and other things had to do that. So we had to do a tremendous pivot in a short time. And that's sort of one of the biggest things we've learned out of that. It's interesting now to reflect on what all that means. And so we're trying to learn what this has meant to people. Has it changed the way that they think about teaching and instruction? We're talking to students. What does this mean to you? Do you want more of this ability to take classes at remote locations? And if so, how would we organize that? Or then there are many people that want to come back face to face, but probably the most interesting thing to me is the notion of hybrid courses. That is some very combination of face to face and online or remote connection, which means you could organize it in all different ways. So that's an innovation that I think will be coming out of that. Of course, we've also been not only the pandemic response, but the tremendous protests and concerns about social justice have been risen are also a challenge to us. And we're also trying to think about that and what it means to us and how we make sure we're doing our part internally to end institutional racism and to create social justice, but how can we be an agent in the community to help that too?
That's great. We've had some conversations over the last, let's say, 8 or 9 weeks with, folks from the state of Oregon, local government, as well as different institutions in the private sector. And a common topic is sustainability and, how to kind of navigate the crisis from a financial standpoint and make sure that they're able to deliver the services and products that everyone expects of them. And I'm wondering, in the context of higher ed, if you could talk a little bit about, how the health and financial crisis has impacted PSU and sort of how do you redefine sustainability for the university going forward?
That's a great question and something that's on our minds all the time. It's always important, I think, to say that before the pandemic, higher education in the country was reaching a bit of a crisis. What do I mean by that? We've seen enrollments on the decline. Because the demographics are such, the number of students graduating high school is declining. We see that the opportunity of many people of color and people from disadvantaged groups increasingly coming to higher education, but we need to make sure we can meet their unique needs and learning to make them successful. We've appreciated a lot of state support, and we've had some of that, but it is not as much as it used to be. And so counting on state government resources cannot be our only source. It isn't our only source, of course. But we're also, tuition is another source of revenue, and we want to keep that as manageable as possible. And there's a pressure to how do you raise your funding to meet your growing costs at the same time you're true to your commitment to an access institution. So balancing those things is quite a bit of a challenge. So financially, we took a big hit in the spring term on our auxiliaries. That's the places we look kind of more like businesses. Our housing, our student rec, our parking. We don't always think of those as major revenue generators, but they are. And our number of students in housing dropped from 1,850 to 600. By the way, 600 was higher than most institutions, but we had students who had nowhere else to go safely. And we said, if you don't, we're going to keep you here. We're going to make sure you're cared for, provide you food, and sustain you in that period. So one of our biggest things has been a shortfall related to fiscal shortfall related to auxiliary operations. Our spring term enrollments came in about as we expected. They were a little bit down, but not much. Now, they were lower than last year, which was a challenge anyway because of this enrollment decline we've been facing. But we did see that our that enrollment maintained, so most of our students did stay enrolled, did take their classes, and are moving forward to that. Our biggest unknown right now is state government funding. The state gives us funding. The state is facing a major fiscal shortfall of its own, and we anticipate that some of that shortfall will be passed along to us. We've been asked to plan for an 8.5% reduction in both the fiscal year that's now ending and the one that's starting July 1st, but we'd have to take the impact of that both years in the second year, the biennium. That's about $17 million. And so we don't know that that's official or final yet. The state legislature is going to meet soon, but we're facing quite a bit of challenge on the fiscal front, and we're trying to figure out how we do that. One thing we're using is our reserves that we've built up, like most businesses, to protect ourselves. And we're waiting to see what the full impact of the state funding will be, and whether or not the next stimulus package by the federal government provides any money to support the states, which then might take some pressure off of us.
That's great. You know, a lot of the people I've talked to have mentioned that this crisis didn't really necessarily create new trends in a lot of cases. It accelerated stuff that was already, you know, going on in large part, and created a sense of urgency around it. And I'm wondering, you know, do you think higher education really needed this crisis in order to move as quickly as it has into some of these hybrid delivery models from an education delivery standpoint? Or, you know, what would you say has been the impact on some stuff that you all have been working on, you know, for many years leading up to this?
Thank you for the question. It's an important one. I don't think we ever needed a pandemic, so let me just be clear about that.
Yeah.
And first, I would say the pandemic. I applaud everyone who went to remote, but everybody agreed it wasn't perfect. We didn't have enough time to do it, and we've actually had a learning. Both students are learning to adapt, and faculty as the term goes on. But it's a very important point that you raise, and I think all of us in higher education are trying to figure that out. What I do know is that we face a major issue of disruption, as everybody on the line has also faced. Major disruption. What do? Well, we found ourselves able to respond quickly, relatively effectively, I think, amazingly so, and to maintain our operations so we didn't disrupt the lives of our students and their education. It did disrupt research, it did disrupt many things, but we were able to keep our core commitment to instruction intact. But I've been impressed by thinking about, boy, if we could take this take disruption and lead to the creativity and the innovation that we have seen, we've shown in higher ed that we can change, maybe faster than we thought about, and that we can embrace new ideas, and that we can take the opportunity to learn from that. So we have a variety of things going on to learn about that and figure out what we have learned in the experience. And we're creating something called PSU Next, which will be new. And part of the idea of that initiative is to think, you know, we have a lot of opportunity to learn about innovation. How can we apply that to other problems that we're facing? And so we're blending in our Futures initiative, which we've been working on this year, some really interesting work and how futurists think about things, so that when you're designing a new plan, you're not just planning for the situation you're in now or the one that you think you'll have next year, but you're planning and thinking about the need to think what are the conditions going into the future that you're going to face, and how you're adapting to those when you do your planning. And so one of the phrases that began to really rub on me in the last few weeks was returning to normal. You know what? We shouldn't be returning to normal. True resilience tells you that when you have a crisis, you need to come out of that stronger than you were. And so that's something that we're committed to at PSU. A process of thinking and being creative, and allowing us to use the same energy that we used to respond to the pandemic to continually embrace the challenges and find new solutions.
One of the questions we got from one of our members was more along the lines of how there's a variety of different approaches that universities around the world are taking to the fall and even spring of next year. In the case of Notre Dame, I think they're welcoming people back in person this fall. You've got Cambridge University in the UK, which decided to go all virtual through next summer. And there's a variety of sort of variations on those two themes. How has PSU approached it from sort of a decision standpoint, and how are you looking at, say, the next academic year?
That question absorbs an awful lot of our time right now, and universities across the country are coming back with different messages and different plans. Clearly, the universities that have been organized where people almost all live on campus and it's a campus life experience are very concerned if they can't offer that same experience. That would be a major problem, that people might not want to come back if they had to be remote. Other universities like Portland State, we have about 2,200 people on campus, but most of the rest of us are coming and going anyway. So I would say two things. First of all, to make that decision, we're trying to monitor health conditions. We're trying to figure out how our systems and our classrooms and our equipment can adapt to that. So for example, large classes are usually offered in spaces where people are pretty tightly compact. So if we're going to have social distancing, then the size capacity of our classrooms kind of shrinks by half or more. So, but I would like to say this to folks, because I've been thinking about this like analogy of a dimmer switch. And it seems to me, if you look closely at most of the packages, there's a whole array of things across it. So it's not only open totally and remote totally, it's some package of that across the country. Most universities are not having packed large classes. Even the ones that say we're open, they're either going to have break it out into smaller sections, or they're going to do those remotely. And so I think there's somewhat of a little bit of a false dichotomy here. It's a much richer mix. So what we're doing at Portland State is we're looking at what areas, what teaching, what instruction just does not work very well remotely. Choral work, performance work, scientific labs, it just is pretty hard to do that remotely. So we're trying to identify those things that have the most need to be done face-to-face. We're also trying to build up our capacity to do remote and then build remote into online, as I mentioned before. So we have a major summer initiative where we're going to have hundreds of faculty members learning how to advance either the skills in working remotely or move to fully online. So for us, we're looking at the health conditions, what the constant new evidence is coming up, the directions from the state and local health authorities, looking at our interests of the faculty, protecting our students. We'll be buying all kinds of personal protective equipment so people can have masks and things. So we're trying to thread the needle in a way that takes account of the needs, the learning needs of students, and adapts to the growing information on health needs. And so we're putting all of that together. We're probably going to be somewhere in the middle of that. We're not going to be, I don't think, totally remote, or are we going to be totally face-to-face? It's trying to figure out what's the right mix in that area.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I know that another question we got was more along the lines of, how a lot of education delivery hasn't necessarily changed a lot in a couple hundred years. I mean, it's still very much like presentation focused in front of a classroom, and there's not a lot of distinction necessarily from what an educational classroom looks like today versus even in the late 1800s. But obviously with this crisis and even before, there were a number of things happening with blended learning and other types of models coming online. And the question, I think, is really about, less so about the model and the delivery of education, which you've talked quite a bit about in your approach to it, but also I think a lot of people look to higher ed as an in-person experience that provides sort of a chance to develop the whole self and the socialization components and getting involved in the community in which the university or college is located. And I'm wondering to what extent you're also thinking about how to navigate that in this hybrid or mostly virtual environment.
Thank you. I would say that I would partially agree, but not completely agree with the premise of the question. I think we have been doing some, not trying to be defensive, but I think we have been doing a lot of things in remote learning. I think we have learned to use technology and other kinds of, rather than strict lecture, we've been doing lots of other kinds of interactive learning. Portland State and Let Knowledge Serve the City has always been a major part of our commitment, and we have an amazing number of engagement experiences that our students do to work in the community. I'm not sure if your audience knows that every single senior at Portland State to complete their general education requirement has to take a course that is a community-based learning experience, meaning every year we have 4,000 students working in some elements of the community, public, private, nonprofit, working in those areas. But the question is still very relevant. We actually had some work on how you would do engagement work remotely, and we actually have some experience with it. It changed, it was different. But we'll have to work with our community partners to ensure that we find ways to make that engagement richer in times of pandemic and other sorts of situations. We're also committed to deepening our community engagement and also to elevating civic engagement. That is the understanding of people of our students and our graduates about the roles that they can play in advancing communities. And our students are very aware of that and very involved, but we're trying to help people think through themselves about what skills do they have and what skills might they like to know to be able to be involved in their communities over a lifetime, and have them think about their lifetime commitment before they leave PSU. They would think about it anyway, but just sort of a more focused attention to that. So we need to be modernizing and learning and finding new ways of learning education. And I truly think, in response to your caller, that this disruption has led us to think, boy, we can do some things different. And I think we'll be embracing a lot of different changes in our instructional patterns and pedagogy.
Yep. And I think many of our members would agree that PSU is definitely a very well integrated institution within the broader community that is Portland and the surrounding area and the state. And I think that what a lot of our members are also wondering is, given some of the challenges that PSU faces, what would your message to them be in terms of how they might be able to help? Like, where would you want them to focus their time and effort and engagement relative to the university as you're trying to navigate the crisis?
Well, I think another opportunity we have here is to build and deepen our relationships with many different stakeholder groups and organizations, including TAO. I think that those partnerships, when they're developed with trust and depth over time, meaning that they will last beyond one person leaving or one class that's being taught, but a deeper connection where we really find out what's the mutual benefit to both parties. And I truly believe it's a mutually beneficial relationship. How do we do that and sustain it and learn together how to do that? How do we, our co-op program where students are working in companies, either half-time or full-time, and sort of taking some time out from their regular studies to do that, how do they do that meaningfully? If we have an internship or some element of that, how do we make that work effectively so that it is not a burden on somebody who's being kind enough to mentor, and it makes sure the experience is truly rich for our students. So I'd be very looking forward to asking us to think about ways we can deepen our connections. And some of our conversations with TAO have already been moving in that direction. And it never helps to have advocates on our side when public authorities are making decisions about funding higher education. We would very much appreciate your voice supporting higher education, and we very much appreciate your voice supporting Portland State.
Fantastic. And as I think about, too, some of the work that's going on at the university as it relates to research, obviously a lot of our member companies participate regularly with faculty in that. Are you seeing much in the way of disruptions on the research side of things? We talked a lot about classroom delivery and education, but what about the research side?
Yeah, research also experienced a disruption because when it became the stay-at-home expectations and the idea that any kind of close mingling of human beings was going to cause health problems, we actually suspended almost all of our research operations. We allowed people to try to shut things down temporarily so they didn't disrupt them in the middle that would completely ruin some program they're working on. So we tried to have a measured kind of shutdown. We took care of all the animals in the few cases where we have animals as part of our research. And so we did need to suspend things. We also were glad to keep our graduate student researchers basically on the payroll in almost every single case. They had to do some of their work remotely. But as you can imagine, there's tension building up. We want to get back to the lab. We want to get back to our research. We've got federal funds here. We've got a timeline to meet our results. And so we're working now on a plan to open up our research operations, which often are not highly dense with people. So I think we'll be able to open those more quickly and allow people into labs. We'll have social distancing requirements and other sort of things, but we want to bring that operation back as quickly as we can.
Great, great. Well, I got the 5-minute warning here, so just wanted to mention that and be respectful of people's time. But one thing that I'm really focused on, in addition to like how can the tech community be more broadly engaged in PSU, is are there some things from the standpoint of internship and other type of opportunities? You mentioned a little bit about that, but obviously the crisis has disrupted a lot of those programs at companies this summer, but many of them are continuing to hire as they look into the fall and beyond. And I'm wondering if there are some things there that you'd like to see more of from the local tech community.
Well, I think it would be interesting. We appreciate always that people take our students on as interns. It's such a valuable experience. It so enriches them and so much and also very significantly enhances their career prospects and their understanding of the workforce. I've talked to many of them, and they come out of those experiences really pretty transformed in things and much better to understand what a workforce is going to be like, what the expectations are, how you can work with colleagues. So it's very important. Just like we're thinking different ways of doing teaching, there may be different ways of doing this student learning experience within the context of a company. And an internship might not be the best way to think about it, or maybe a new, deeper vision of what an internship is. It multiple terms? How do we build deeper relationships? So I'd be very open to rethinking with partners like you and the companies and businesses that are part of your organization of how can we enrich that experience? Are there other ways of doing that would provide a deeper experience that would be beneficial on both sides? So I'd say let's throw off the shackles of traditional ways of doing things and let's think about how we might do it by starting by what we would like to achieve and then working back to how we would do it.
Yep, that's great. So I'll end with a question we've thrown out there to each of our featured guests, which is a little bit more irreverent, and it's in this virtual environment that we now find ourselves. What's the most embarrassing or awkward mishap that you've encountered in this virtual environment?
Well, I've learned that some people suffer from a major challenge of unmuting, and I don't know what that comes from, but there are certain people that will go unnamed that in any conversation never realize whether they're mute or unmute, and then when they realize they're on mute, they don't know how to get off it very quickly. So I think that that's a new category of challenge we need to be working with. One of the people I work with a lot at the university, I've kind of developed a friendship with her daughter. So she came online one day. I said, "Is Ruby there? Can we come speak with it?" And I said, "Ruby, how's it going?" And she said, "Well, it's going pretty well, but my mom's into this extra credit thing." And she went on and on about it, much to the embarrassment of her mother. But she was saying, her mother was saying they needed to go above and beyond in their remote learning there. So Ruby and I had quite a discussion about her challenge of dealing with the extra credit requirements being levied by her parents. But that was really fun.
Nice. It's funny because we've gotten like a different story from just about everyone we've talked about. All have been very different observations. So never a dull moment and lots of mishaps in virtual environments. So I want to thank you, Dr. Percy, for spending some time with us. I know you're incredibly busy, and I know our members were looking forward to this, as was I. I also wanted to say thank you to AT&T and to Portland State University as well for their ongoing support. We couldn't do this series without them. And thank you to all for spending some time with us this Friday. We hope you all have a good end of your week and a nice weekend, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.